It's 6:17 p.m. on a Wednesday. Somewhere in Ohio, a woman is sitting at her kitchen table opening a letter from her health insurance company. Her premium has increased by 34%. The letter cites updated risk assessment data. She doesn't understand what that means. She calls the number on the back. Nobody explains it clearly. What she doesn't know is that 3 months ago, her purchasing history, compiled from her grocery loyalty card, her pharmacy receipts, her fitness app, and 14 other sources she agreed to without reading, was packaged into a health risk profile and sold to a data aggregator. You sold it. Not her specifically. You never think about specific people. You think about datasets. Clean, structured, monetizable datasets. 47 million records in the batch that included her. $0.003 per record on the wholesale end. $127,000 total. Deposited before the weekend. You are sitting in your apartment right now, eating dinner, not thinking about the woman in Ohio. That's the part that should concern you most. You were 23 when you took the job at the marketing analytics firm. Entry level. $51,000 a year. A open plan office with too much natural light and not enough privacy, a desk between two people whose names you learned and immediately began forgetting, and a job title that said, Junior Data Analyst, in a way that emphasized the junior. The work was legitimate. Completely, boringly legitimate. You processed consumer behavior datasets for clients who wanted to understand their customers better. Which demographics bought which products? Which marketing messages resonated with which age groups? Which zip codes contained concentrations of people likely to respond to specific offers? You were good at it. Better than good, you had a natural instinct for finding patterns in large datasets that your colleagues missed, for asking the question one level deeper than the obvious one, for understanding not just what the data said but what it implied about the people behind it. Your manager noticed. Gave you harder projects. Larger datasets. More complex client briefs. And through the harder projects and the larger datasets you began to understand something that the job had never explicitly taught you. Data about people was worth vastly more than what anyone was paying for it. Not the processed, sanitized, aggregated data that your firm sold to clients in the form of reports and dashboards. The raw data. The individual level records. The file that said not 34% of women aged 28 to 35 in this zip code purchased this product. But this specific woman, at this specific address, purchased this product on this date, and also these 12 other products, and visited these websites, and searched for these terms, and her credit score is in this range, and she has 2 children, and she drives this kind of car. That file, the individual, the complete picture, the person reduced to a data point with 200 attributes attached, was worth something entirely different. You started paying attention to where the raw data came from. The sources were everywhere once you knew how to look. Your firm received data from data brokers, companies that aggregated consumer information from hundreds of sources and sold it in bulk. Loyalty card programs. Public records. App permissions that users granted without reading. Website tracking pixels. Purchase history sold by retailers. Location data sold by mobile carriers. Financial behavior patterns licensed from credit bureaus. All of it legal. All of it disclosed somewhere in terms of service documents that ran to 40 pages of language specifically designed to be unread. You started mapping the ecosystem in a notebook you kept in your desk drawer. Not for any specific purpose. You told yourself it was professional development, that understanding the supply chain made you better at your job. Which was true. It also made you understand exactly where the money was and exactly how much of it was moving through channels that the people whose data it was would never see or know about. One afternoon your manager sent you to a meeting with one of the firm's data suppliers. A company 3 floors up in the same building. You hadn't known they existed until the calendar invite appeared. The meeting was routine. Licensing terms. Data refresh schedules. Compliance documentation. But the person across the table, a man in his late 30s with the specific ease of someone who had stopped worrying about money a long time ago, mentioned a number in passing. his company's annual revenue from data licensing. You did the math on the way back to your desk. He was making, per employee, 11 times what your firm made per employee on the same data. The difference was position in the supply chain. Your firm bought processed data and sold insights. His company owned raw data and sold it to everyone. The insights were valuable. The raw data was the asset. You sat at your desk for the rest of the afternoon and thought about what it would take to own the asset. You spent 4 months researching before you built anything. The legal landscape first. Data brokerage existed in a regulatory gray zone in most jurisdictions, legal in principle, with specific prohibitions around certain categories and certain uses, but broadly permissible in ways that surprised you the more you read. Companies bought and sold personal information at industrial scale with minimal oversight. The framework assumed that consent had been given somewhere in the chain of data collection, and the definition of consent was broad enough to cover most of what the industry actually did. You were not planning to stay within the legal framework, but understanding it told you exactly where the edges were and what crossing them looked like. The technical architecture next. You needed data sources, multiple, diverse, cross-referenceable. You needed storage infrastructure. You needed a cleaning and enrichment pipeline that could take raw inputs from different sources and produce standardized, queryable output. You needed a front end that clients could use to search and purchase. You built the scraping tools first. Quiet, distributed scrapers running across cloud infrastructure registered under a shell company you formed online for $200. They pulled from public records databases, property ownership, court filings, voter registration in states where it was public, business registration documents. Legal sources, technically, aggregated and packaged in ways the original publishers hadn't intended and hadn't consented to. Then you added the darker sources. Breach databases. The accumulated wreckage of a decade of corporate security failures, billions of records from hacked companies, floating freely through certain corners of the internet, containing emails, passwords, phone numbers, partial financial information, security question answers. You didn't hack anyone to get them. You purchased access to aggregated breach repositories through channels you found on forums you'd been reading since you started mapping the ecosystem. Cross-referencing a public records database with a breach database produced something qualitatively different from either source alone. A name and address from public records, matched to an email and phone number from a breach, matched to a purchasing history scraped from a retail loyalty program that had itself been breached, produced a profile that was specific, detailed, and worth something real. You ran your first test batch. 100,000 records. Cleaned, enriched, formatted. You looked at one record at random. A man, 47, in Minnesota. His name, address, phone number, email, approximate income range, vehicle registration, 2 email addresses from different breaches, a list of purchases from 3 different retailers, a location history reconstructed from app data in one of the breach databases, the names of his children inferred from school enrollment records that were technically public. You stared at it for a long time. Then you opened the next record. You didn't go to the established brokers first. The established brokers had compliance departments and due diligence processes and questions about data provenance that you couldn't answer honestly. You went to the gray market, the buyers who needed data that moved faster and asked fewer questions than the legitimate supply chain provided. Private investigators. Skip tracers. Debt collection agencies operating at the aggressive end of the industry. Political consulting firms during election cycles. Occasionally individuals whose stated purpose you didn't investigate, and whose real purpose you didn't want to know. Your first sale was to a skip tracing firm. A company that located people who had stopped paying debts, stopped showing up for court dates, stopped being findable through normal channels. They needed current contact information, phone numbers, addresses, emails, for a list of 300 individuals. You ran the list against your database. Found current information for 247 of them. Delivered a clean spreadsheet. $3,700. Transferred within the hour. You sat at your apartment desk. You had stopped going to the office 2 weeks earlier, submitted a resignation via email, received an automated acknowledgement, and looked at the number. $3,700 for work that had taken 90 minutes. The data already existed in your database. The matching was automated. The delivery was a spreadsheet export. Your marginal cost for the job was effectively zero. That was the moment you understood the business model at a level that went beyond intellectual appreciation. The data was an asset that could be sold infinitely. Not consumed by sale. Not depleted by use. The same record could be sold to 10 different buyers. 100. The asset didn't diminish. You started scaling. 6 months later, the database held 340 million records. Not all American, you had expanded into European data through breach repositories, into Asian consumer data through gray market suppliers in 3 countries, into financial behavior data purchased from a source you deliberately knew very little about. The clients had diversified too. Insurance companies, not the established ones, the aggressive new entrants trying to build risk models faster than their competitors. They bought health behavior data, purchasing pattern data, location data that revealed lifestyle information. They fed it into underwriting models. Premiums went up for people whose data said they were risky in ways those people had never been told they were being assessed. Landlords, property management companies running tenant screening operations that went well beyond the standard credit check. They bought financial behavior profiles, social media data, inferred relationship information. Tenants were rejected for apartments based on data they didn't know existed about them. Employers, HR consulting firms running background enrichment services that supplemented official background checks with data that official background checks couldn't legally include. Medical history inferences. Financial stress indicators. Political affiliation data. You told yourself these were the client's decisions. That you were selling information, not making choices about how it was used. That the data existed regardless of whether you sold it. You built the front end. A clean, professional interface. Clients created accounts, specified their search criteria, received results, paid per record. Automated. Scalable. Requiring almost no involvement from you once the infrastructure was running. Monthly revenue crossed $400,000. You moved to a better apartment. Bought better equipment. Hired a contractor, someone you found online, paid through a shell company, who maintained the technical infrastructure without knowing what it served. You did not celebrate any of this. You noticed that you were not celebrating and filed the observation away without examining it. The message came through the platform's client interface on a Tuesday morning. A new account. Verified through your standard process, shell company, offshore payment method, the markers of a client who understood operational security. Their request was specific. They wanted records on a list of 847 individuals. Journalists, activists, lawyers. People who had in common, as far as you could determine from the names, that they were involved in some capacity in documenting human rights violations in a specific country. Current addresses. Phone numbers. Family member information. Daily location patterns inferred from app data. The price they offered was $280,000. You sat with the request for 2 days. You told yourself you didn't know what it would be used for. That was true in the narrow sense that no one had told you explicitly. But you knew what a list of human rights workers' home addresses and family members' names was for. You had enough information to know what happened to people on lists like that in the country the client appeared to be associated with. You had built a policy document when you started the platform. A list of prohibited use cases. Human rights violations was on the list. You thought about $280,000. You thought about the policy document. You approved the request. The data delivered automatically. The payment cleared. The account went dormant. You did not search for news from that country in the following weeks. You made a deliberate decision not to search. If you didn't look, you didn't know. If you didn't know, the weight of it stayed theoretical. You opened the platform dashboard. Checked the revenue figures. Responded to 3 pending client inquiries. The weight stayed theoretical for about 6 weeks. A journalist published a story. Not about you, your name wasn't in it, Your platform wasn't named, your infrastructure was invisible behind layers of shell companies and offshore registrations. But the story was about the data ecosystem that your platform was part of. A detailed investigation into how personal data flowed from collection through aggregation through sale into uses that the people whose data it was would never have agreed to. The journalist had a source inside one of your client companies. The story included specific examples. A woman in Ohio whose health insurance premium had increased after her purchasing data was used in underwriting. A tenant rejected from an apartment based on inferred financial stress data. An activist in a foreign country whose location data had been used to track his movements. You read the story 3 times. The activist mentioned in the story, you searched his name. Found a report from a human rights organization published 4 weeks earlier. He had been detained. The report described the detention as targeted. Suggested authorities had known his location and the locations of people associated with him in advance. You sat at your desk for a long time. You had not pulled his specific record. You had sold a batch of 847 records and his had been among them. The automation had processed it the same as the others. No human decision had been made about him specifically. The system had just run. You had built the system. You started sleeping badly. Not dramatically, not nightmares, not obvious distress. Just the specific sleeplessness of a mind that has found something it can't file away and won't stop returning to at 3 a.m. You hired a lawyer through a cutout. Asked general questions about data broker liability in abstract terms. The lawyer's answers were technically reassuring and practically useless because the thing you were actually worried about wasn't legal liability. It was something without a legal name. The platform kept running. That was the thing you hadn't anticipated. That you could be sitting in an apartment at 3 a.m. not sleeping and the platform would keep running anyway. Clients querying. Records delivering. Payments clearing. The machine operated independently of whether you were functional. Monthly revenue, $620,000. You had stopped checking the figures with any feeling attached to them. You checked them the way you checked the weather, information, noted, filed, irrelevant to how you actually felt. You started doing the thing you'd deliberately not done before. You looked at individual records. Not for clients. Not for any operational reason. You would open the database interface, generate a random record, and look at it. A woman, 34, in Georgia. Her name. Her address. Her children's names, inferred from school enrollment records. Her approximate salary. Her medical purchasing patterns suggesting a chronic condition she hadn't disclosed to her insurance company. Her location history showing she visited a specific medical clinic every 3 weeks. You looked at her for a long time. Then you generated another record. A man, 61, in Oregon. Retired. His financial behavior suggesting he was approaching the end of his savings. His search history, reconstructed from a breached database, showing he'd been researching reverse mortgages. His phone number. His email. His adult children's contact information. You thought about the clients who would buy a record like his. The debt collection firms. The financial product marketers. The scammers, operating through clients you couldn't distinguish from legitimate buyers, who specifically targeted people in financial distress. You closed the interface. Opened it again an hour later. Generated another record. You understood what you were doing. You were making yourself look at what the numbers represented. Forcing a connection your operational discipline had spent 2 years preventing. It wasn't atonement. It wasn't research. It was something more like compulsion, the mind insisting on seeing what it had been carefully not seeing. The records didn't stop being records. The people in them didn't become real to you in any actionable sense. You didn't shut the platform down. You didn't reach out to anyone. You didn't confess. You just looked. Every night. Different records. Same hollow feeling expanding slowly in your chest like something filling with cold water. You were 27 years old. Your apartment was expensive and quiet. Your bank accounts held more money than you had targets for. Your platform ran without you. And every night at 3 a.m. you sat at your desk and generated random records and looked at the people inside them and felt the distance between yourself and any version of yourself you recognized closing slowly, from both directions, towards something you didn't have a name for yet. On a Sunday you call your mother. She asks how work is going. You say fine. She asks what you've been up to. You say not much. She says you sound tired. You say you haven't been sleeping well. She says she's been getting strange calls. Someone trying to sell her a financial product she didn't ask about, using information about her finances that she hadn't given anyone. How did they know that, she asks. You tell her you're not sure. That this kind of thing happens. That she should just hang up. You know exactly how they knew. Not the specific sale, you can't trace it that precisely. But you know the ecosystem. You know how a record like hers moved from a source she'd never consented to through an aggregator she'd never heard of through a platform she'd never known existed to a marketer who called her on a Sunday afternoon. You might have sold that record. Or something that contributed to building it. You say goodbye. Tell her you'll call again next week. Sit at your desk. The platform dashboard shows the week's revenue. $147,000. Clean. Automated. Requiring nothing from you. You open the database interface. Generate a random record. A woman, 58, in Ohio. You stare at her for a long time. You don't know if she's the woman from the opening. The one with the insurance letter. The 34% premium increase. You have 47 million records from that batch. The probability is small. But she could be. She has a name. 2 adult children. A health condition inferred from her purchasing history. A financial profile suggesting she's not comfortable but managing. A phone number. An email address. A home address and a zip code you could find on a map. She agreed to none of this. She is a record in a database that has been sold 17 times since it was first compiled. She will never know. The platform keeps running. You keep looking. The money keeps arriving. And the hollow thing in your chest keeps filling, slowly, with something that has no name but that you recognize now as the cost of treating people as assets. The asset doesn't diminish with sale. But apparently you do.